So it's about a quarter of. We'll work till no later than 3, maybe till 2. Depends on what y'all want to do. So I think we left at a good spot there. Jim told me, and I think Mike will corroborate that he felt like he got what he needed at this point in his process. So that was very helpful and appreciated. And whenever we have important issues that come up that need to be discussed, that's what we're here to do. And so that worked out really well. I'm glad that everybody was flexible enough to do that. And it was a good conversation. And it also helped, I think, in our discussion that we're going to continue with. So let's go back to the agenda. And this really was right on the agenda in some ways. So let's talk about the healthy and productive bay ecosystem. And I'm really hoping that we don't spend much time at all on anything like goals and objectives and outcomes, because I think you did plenty of work on that. Start talking about key issues and strategies, just like we did on one of our strategies, with considering closure of, or recommending the closure of the wild harvesting in that Apalachicola Bay. So that's a strategy and a recommendation that was made. Let's talk about, and we talked about a whole bunch of other ones, so we may have covered this sufficiently, but I want to test that before I move into B, C, or D. So if you turn to your agenda packs on page 9, where's Ed? Ed, would you mind coming back to the table?
I warned you.
No, I'm not going to let you get away with that. And y'all too, so Sandra and Felicia and Ed, I think this is a conversation that you should actively participate in. So as we think about what we're trying to achieve on the healthy ecosystem, what are our goals, which we've laid out, and we've talked about strategies, one of which was the closure, but also we mentioned a bunch of other things like rotational harvest. The parameters for what a closure reopening might be. We talked about limited entry. We talked about restoration, culching, location, water flow. We talked about a lot of different things that need to be considered and evaluated. So we're proposing a draft set of performance measures. So these are what this is what we'll measure our outcome, our strategies against. Do they achieve the goals for ecosystem services? And what are the goals we're trying to do? So if you look on the bottom of page 9, here's a long list of potential and potential performance measures, things that, and I'm going to look to Ed and Sandra and Felicia to say, are these things that we can measure? Do we have the decision support tools, be it a model or some other decision support tool, that it would allow us to assess our strategies and use these metrics as whether we achieve success, whether this strategy is likely to achieve success. If we model it, says it probably would. When we start combining all the things together, then we have to relook at those and see whether they work well together or whether they don't work well together. And this is a list of things. How many actually took a peek at this for the meeting? Okay. So I'm going to let you take a peek through there. Ed, would you like to say something about these performance measures and your thoughts on what, for your modeling? Because you're really working, your model is right in the heart of what we're doing here in terms of the oyster system.
I don't have anything really specific. The one point that I would make is that a lot of the performance measures listed here are what I have termed things like means. Performance measures they're measures that are trying to get you towards a more fundamental one, and the fundamental one here appears to be a sustainable oyster population, not just a sustainable oyster fishery. And so I think that that's a much harder thing to identify the performance measures for, because we really don't know what to measure for that. And it may be different than things like numbers and prices. It may be things like the height of reef and the spatial area of live reef. That I think those are the things that are going to be most closely related to ecosystem services, as well as linearly correlated with moving in the same direction with the fishery. So I don't have any problem with what's here, but I think that it will probably condense down to just a couple of things.
Yeah, and that's one of the things we'll do. So, Sandra, Felicia.
One of the things that Steve Lightman mentioned before he left was
the key focus should be something in there that, we come up with a metrics of what we think would be an acceptable, level of freshwater inflow. And you have to know if that's, attainable or not, and under what circumstances it might be.
Okay, great, so we'll add that to the list. So, go ahead.
The only other thing to add here would be, and this was relayed to me by Tom, but he said that probably should be considering what monitoring information you need to collect to be able to demonstrate what the level of oysters are and how they're responding to those things on the float.
Okay.
Does that make sense to everybody? We have lacked that in the past, and I think it's what the state is a disadvantage.
Closer to the mic.
Sorry. So one of the things that's going to be important is not just understanding what the population of oysters are. We know we need to bring that back, but also we have to be able to demonstrate how that population is being affected by environmental conditions such as flow. So lack that capacity to monitor it, it may be disadvantaging the state in ways that it has in the past few years.
Right. So these performance measures, so you understand where they came from. Some of these were ones that I took from Maryland because they were ones that our modelers were able to model. Some of these were ones that you added at the last meeting. So everything underlined is something that's new. Some, a lot of what you added at the last meeting, and others I asked Ed and Sandra and Felicia to review our list and to provide additional potential performance measures for you to consider. So the goal, this is for goal A. This is a healthy ecosystem. These are the ecosystem services component. Goal B, we'll get into the fishery management, the harvesting piece of it. Is this a good set of metrics that you think would indicate that yes, this strategy, if these improve, then our strategy is working. If it's not, then we need to reconsider that strategy. And the model can run those simulations and tell us, how likely it is and what it will improve. Anybody have any thoughts on the list? Good, Jenna.
Just real quick, I got into the weeds last time on this. This first theme is focused on a healthy and productive bay ecosystem holistically, not just the oyster resources, correct? So B theme is focused on the oyster resources. So I would propose that the metrics or measures that we look at under A are focused on the whole ecosystem, and the indicators of whole ecosystem health, as opposed to under B would be specific for the oyster resources, the oyster fishery. Am I interpreting that correctly?
It's exactly correct what you said. That's exactly right.
Okay.
Yep. So we're trying to do a parallel thing. Ecosystem services is an important piece. That's why it's A. Here's the things we need to do. And then, looking to the historic, if there's been historically a fishery, when it's both aquaculture and while harvesting, what do we have to do to reestablish some level of that, like we discussed earlier? And so those performance metrics would be specific to that. These are for the whole system, like you described.
Okay.
Yep. Steve?
On this list here, I see kind of two different categories. The first has to do with the abundance of oysters, which there's a number of other things there that are all just another way of saying abundance of oysters or related to abundance of oysters, like spat. That's all depending on the abundance of oysters, basically, I guess. The other one is things like sedimentation rate, and oyster refight, changes in nutrients and stuff like that, which are a result. Some of those are a result or product of the abundance of oysters. So I don't know how we could have some of those without the abundance of oysters. With our efforts, lupus, we're not gonna put much effort into trying to regulate pollutants and runoffs. So that's, I assume, related to oysters filtering the water. So the abundance of oysters is kind of the key thing. Everything else is secondary. If there's an abundance of oysters, all this other stuff is going to occur.
Okay. I hear your point. I think there's just a variation in different types of, sorry, maybe many of them are a function of an abundance of oysters, but it's just one measurement. So there's a whole bunch of, different types of measurements. I'd rather our scientists suggest that in terms of abundance of oysters being the sort of overarching, or all these distances, these are all considered important. Excuse me.
We need more of these things. So, yeah, Steve, your point's well made. And when we were going through this list, we recognized that there was redundancy in this list, and that it would be honed down over time to make it more streamlined. But I think the thought was we'd leave all of these options on the table and then narrow them down as the group saw fit.
Right, exactly, thank you. Yeah, we may combine, and I think when our modelers start building the models and doing things, they will say, we'll come back and say, well, these three work together, let's make this one, so that's important. Okay.
Yeah, good. The fourth one there, number of large oysters greater than 5 inches. I don't think we get any 5-inch oysters in this bay. I suggest that be lowered to maybe 3 inches.
Well, you might get them in the sanctuary or marine protected area.
I'd be really surprised.
I'm with Lee, that's, to you, very, that's, in my lifetime, I haven't seen maybe one or two that's that size in this bay, and that's down in the miles.
Now Chesapeake, I mean, it's colder water, they grow slower. They might get 5-inch oysters, but I don't think.
Well,
I've never,
you
the
look at
only
the
oysters
40
bigger than 5 inches I've seen are fossilized ones that are
Well, the only thing I'd add to that is in Pensacola, one of our watermen is every meeting brings in oysters, shows us he's still out there harvesting, he's like one of the last people that are like this. So it's the same, it's not the same bay system, but it's, similar temperatures.
Well, I mean, that would be an easy one to do because you'd be 0.
Well, that's fine, so what's the right number then? Larger than 4, larger than 3?
What are you trying to get from that performance measure?
That not every oyster is being taken off the reef like this, I mean, really.
It just seems like 3, since that's the harvest size, it's a good number to use. But I don't think 5 works in this bay.
Okay, well, that's good, that's important. So, propose a change in number, you're saying 3 inches, Shannon, what do you think? 3 or 4?
Lee?
Yeah, it could be 3.5, that's okay.
Is everybody okay changing that from 5 to 3.5? Is that your question too?
No, I think,
Yours is next anyway.
well, I think it's along the lines of these large oysters. I mean, if 5 isn't achievable, I don't know if 3 is appropriate to go that low, because we're talking about the ecosystem, not the fishery itself. 3 is the fishery.
True.
So having a 4, if 4 is achievable or whatever, then that would make more sense to me, because you're also talking about size structure throughout the reef. You're not just talking 3-inch oyster then can be harvested. You're talking about having those older, larger size oysters.
So what you're measuring in this case is if we're proposing strategies and the model runs simulations out in years that these strategies all work together, then would we, there might be forage, oysters and fisheries at that point, and then that would be a metric. And that's kind of what this is getting to, not what we're expecting to find right now based on current conditions. Correct.
I mean, I think I'm gonna agree with a couple of people that just mentioned this, that if that's the point, then it's really more of an indication of history than it is an objective for the ecosystem services. Now, I'm not aware of science that suggests that we have some big increase in the ecosystem services of oysters when we have 4-inch oysters relative to 3-inch oysters. I think the point is just there has to be a sustainable use of the bay such that we have adult populations of oysters, but that would then push this back down into section 2.
Okay, so your suggestion that this might be a better metric in B, maybe it'd be a different number, but
If it is in fact intended to be a reflection of what's left, what we get when we change the fishery restrictions, which sounds like what you're saying, what other folks are saying.
The benefit, I think, to 3 is, we have a lot of historic data that DAX has collected, and they put everything into size categories. And the last size category is greater than 3 inches. So if you wanna start collecting data and you wanna use a performance measure, they have years and years worth of data that has the category greater than 3. I don't think they have anything above that, if I remember the data. So at least you have something to compare to historically, going back 30, 40 years.
sounds reasonable to me, it's up to the group. So 2 suggestions is one is to move it greater than 3, and then the second would be to move this into category B. Go ahead, you were actually next,
Yes,
Mike, not Jim.
I think also in support of that is if Dax or whoever is reporting size classes, if greater than 3 is a category, then, and you're looking for that 5 or 4, then you're talking about programmatically changing that data that's already being collected. So that would be a hurdle to trying to do that.
Go ahead. You need to move the mic. You're not allowed to speak for the mic.
Do I need the mic? Yes? I'll need it. Okay, so if the, my question is if that size 3 for harvest, what proportion of the population is actually mature at 3 inches? So like in fish populations, it's often measured at about 50% of the population is mature by whatever the lower size limit is. And so what's the maturity size? Size I realize is not necessarily the best measure, it probably should be age, but you know, I'm reading this thing and it says it takes about 18 to 24 months to mature, to become adults or grow to market size. So it's not, I don't know where that is. So what is it here? Anyway, but the question applies anyway is, what size is 100% of the oysters mature, or 90%, or something more than 50%? Does anybody know the answer? That's a question.
Yeah, I mean, you know, some of the studies that Menzel did back in the 50s,
Uh-huh.
he got a 3-inch harvestable oyster in 39 weeks down in mines. So it depends on where you are, but
That's a harvest.
I'm pretty sure that that's a harvestable oyster.
Yeah.
But I'm pretty sure that, I'd be surprised if there was a 3-inch oyster that wasn't mature. I'd be amazed. Yeah. And I'm not an oyster biologist, but,
All right, well, it sounds like folks are more comfortable with that metric since it's an existing figure, and it's fine. Lee, you have a second piece of it.
yeah, the one after that, biomass of oysters across all habitat types. I guess my concern with that is, are we talking about the soft tissue when we say biomass? Because if you go out in wintertime and shuck out oysters, and you go out in summertime and shuck out oysters, the weight of the soft tissue is going to be twice as much in the wintertime as it is in the summertime. Because they're fat and they're, you know, and in the summertime they've already spawned, most of them. So they, you know, they're just, so biomass is different for the same size oyster, depending on what season you're in. And I know Dax has a formula they use to come up with the pounds of oyster meat based on the pounds of shell. So that's the question, is this soft tissue or oyster meat itself? Is it the whole oyster? And it's different, like I say, depending on the season.
All right, let's, Sonia. This is a science.
Actually, I'm going to throw Ed under the bus for this one, because I think this was a biomass estimate. I might be wrong, but I think this was something that Ed came up with. And this is the question I had too, Lee, is that what are we talking about here? Are we talking about whole oysters or shucked meat? Because different measurements use the different things. And I don't know that there's any harvest metric that uses total biomass, they measure in bags, is that transferable to meat? It sounds like there is a correlation, but it depends on season. This is something I think that needs to be defined up front, and if we define it as total mass of shell of live oysters, then what does that mean in the context of other metrics? So this is, I think this is a point that's up for discussion.
Yeah, and depending on how much attached critters you have, you can get different, if you include the whole stuff. It's something we need to think about what that means.
Shannon?
For you to pick.
And
just to throw into the mix too, if you have intertidal oysters, the coon oysters are growing, very fast and elongated, which is not necessarily a good market oyster. And so for the fishery, it's not equal, but for ecosystem services, it's equal. I'll just throw that out there that, you may have a morphology that is a fast grower and you've got great, filtration going on, but you're not gonna sell those oysters, right? So.
Okay. Fine. You're good. All right.
Extra information, not necessary.
Chad?
I think Tom got us to switch, this theme used to be B. And we switched it from B to A. And so I'm trying to figure out where what I'm about to say
Before you
actually fits.
do that, can I clarify? What we switched is the order, so,
Okay, that's what I mean.
yeah, so we had the fishery first,
Right.
and ecosystem second, we did this first.
That was a pretty big switch.
And all the stuff throughout the document, like that, would correlate to that order.
So here's my question for this metric. Seems to be a healthy and productive bay ecosystem. I don't know is that the boundary that we've defined for what we're doing here? Or is that include a healthy and productive river system? So my question, my metric I'm asking you is related to the river keeper's current project to restore the sloughs up the river. And if the water comes out of the dam and goes straight down the river, never gets into the sloughs, it gets in the floodplain and the bay doesn't get the nutrients and all that kind of stuff. So I'm wondering if there's a metric, they're doing 5 sloughs to try to restore flows into the floodplain. That's a pilot project to do other sloughs. It's $5 million, so it's a pretty big project for the basin. So I'm wondering that metric, and it could be defined as number of sloughs that are connected to the river at certain flow levels. Is that where this metric goes? Because that's a key metric, even though, and that depends on what kind of flows you're getting, whether they're coming out of the floodplain or they're just coming straight down the channel with nothing in them for nutrients.
So the answer to the question, leaving it aside for a second, which I'm gonna come back to you all on over there, what the boundaries of our actual project are, the answer is yes, that would fit in this particular area.
So I would say that would be the metric. I think they're working on 5. I don't know, I think they'll succeed, but maybe the metric is what's success? Is it open for a year or 5 years? And another metric would be, does that pilot project lead to more slough restoration, which opens more? It's a big question for what we're trying to do here because of nutrients and the flow, and also the amount of water you get depends on how often it gets in the floodplain, which depends on how much nutrients. So I don't know if you can just define this bay ecosystem. What is that? Is that the river too?
It does include the river, but we haven't quite got our heads around how far up the river. So we're interested in how the river contributes to the bay ecosystem. But I think that's a point that's open to discussion, is how far up do we include? I mean, we're not going to go all the way up into the river. What we're focusing on is the bay, but where does that actually start? And your point about the floodplain is well taken, because it's influences the amount of food that comes in, even though some work done by Joe Chanton back in the 90s showed that a lot of the food in the bay is autochthonous. It's like produced in the bay rather than coming from the floodplain. But I think we're open to suggestions on where to draw that line. It's a grey area.
Well, it's also connected to how this project relates to all these other projects that are going on and whether we're operating in a silo. I think that's one of the criticisms of
let's say just the input is, how do you take what everybody else is doing and done, and how does that all fit together with this? You've got this $10 million project, that's $5 million project, it's just right up the river, it's a cut.
Well, I think that we're not operating in a silo, and that.
No, I'm not, that's not me saying that.
No, I understand.
You don't
I
ask for
understand.
feedback, I'm hearing that from other people.
And I think what we just heard,
It's
so we,
siloed, all that kind of stuff.
right, yeah, so, I mean, this is a project that was defined
Yeah.
for a specific purpose, and every project has a certain goal. We're aware of the other projects, and we are collaborating with other projects, just like the NIFLA project's been brought in here, we have to take this as an important thing. I think y'all, the team is open to evaluating how this all works together and thinking it through. I mean, we have a definition, but you just heard Sandra say that, that's, we're still trying to define that. So, those are good comments.
Yeah, and obviously we have limited capacity and resources, and I think the idea is to get the members of each project, even though they each have their own kind of jurisdiction, some of which might overlap, is to use inputs from one into the other. That's the most efficient way of doing it. So, we're working with Georgia and the project that she has to remove some of the Army Corps dredge spoil, and we'll look at the end results of that. We're not involved in that project, but we are considering it in terms of ramifications and the influence on that.
And just to follow that, because having thought through this with the team, with the team, and that's why George is here, that's why you're here, and all of you are here, because we really did try to consider it as much as we could, and this will be an adaptive process too. Steve?
Lee brought up something about oyster meat and stuff like that, Mike, you can correct me, but if I'm wrong, but FWC reports landings in pounds of oyster meat. They do abundance and stuff like that in bushels, so there's two different kind of measurements, and the best that I can tell, the conversion factor for bushels to pounds of oyster meat was about 6 pounds of oyster meat per bushel.
Yeah, I don't know those conversion factors off the top of my head. I will tell you this, that even Gulf-wide, there's a big discussion about various reporting metrics. I was at the Gulf States Commission meeting yesterday, talking oysters, and there's a lot of questions about that and how to streamline that, so there's actually some comparability across the entire Gulf and landings data, so. But so the trip ticket is reported in pounds, and then that is
Pounds of oysters in the shell.
pounds of oysters in the shell, and then that is then can be converted through conversion factor to pounds of meat from that. So
The state reports their landings in pounds of oyster meat. Oyster
I
meat,
think both.
it's available in both. I mean, because there's a conversion from pounds in shell
right?
to just pounds of meat, but the base of that conversion is what's reported on the trip ticket, pounds in shell, pounds with shell.
But if you look at FWC's website where they have landings and
Yes.
fish and everything, it's always in pounds of fish, and the conversion is to pounds of oyster meat. If you look,
Correct.
if you look at the FWC data, when they go to oysters, it's oyster meat. But using that conversion factor, I know it started out as bushels, that kind of stuff, but they use that so they can compare landings of food fish and other kinds of fish.
Right.
I've had that discussion with Jim, because, like you said, there's a certain time of the year you chuck a bushel of oysters and get 2 pints. Other times of the year you might get 8 pints or pounds, 2 pounds or 8 pounds, so it's a big variant. I guess they try to come up with some type of average, and I don't know exactly how accurate that is.
And that's part of those larger Gulf-wide discussions, is how to streamline it. Is it being looked at seasonally? Is one conversion factor being used in the spring and one in the summer, or whatever? But that's a Gulf-wide discussion, to be honest.
Yeah, that's good, so we should think through what would be the best metric for measuring this. And again, this is, as you described, the service, you said, it might be a similar one, but it's slightly different in the house. So use it.
I feel like
the distance you're gonna go up the river is a foundational piece of information, and we should get that decided soon, rather than, to me, you have a lot of expertise here, and probably something we should decide. It's a huge contributing factor and a huge source of problem. So what do you think? First thing that comes to my mind is, well, if we hadn't had so many changes lately, it would be where you stop reading salinity, which is 52 miles.
We're about six.
Oh, we're about six, so,
That's
yeah,
basically the gist of it. But the title
Maybe a few
goes all
miles.
the way up another 20 miles.
that's what I was thinking, yeah, Tyler Cohen, so, I don't know. We say that. Just keep on. So if we say our northern boundary, for the sake of argument, is 20 miles up the river, then that kind of puts us into a position where we have to include research and monitoring 20 miles up the river. I'm hesitant to do that if it's going to overlap with what somebody else is doing. So if we can work with another project to say, all right, we need information on tidal incursion, and you collecting that data. But 20 miles up the river, quite honestly, is further upstream than we had conceived of going. So if there's a way of rationally bringing it back to somewhere that's closer, sort of confined within the bay, because we're going east and west of the, well, we're going east of the bay as well. So we don't want to spread ourselves so far, and is the value of that data worth the effort of collecting it to our project? See, there's considerations on that, and I don't know. I don't know the answers to those questions. So that's one point we could do, 20 miles up the river. It seems a little bit odd, whatever. Yeah.
40 river mile 6. I mean, we're definitely gonna take into consideration, I think, the project has, it's a proposal that has certain requirements, and, it's important that those are achieved as well, so it's a balance. But I think we can certainly cooperate and work together with these other projects and bring that information in here. So, I mean, why don't you think on that, Sandra, talk to Triumph Board, whatever it is you do, and think about what would be a reasonable, given the time, duration and the resources and the task at hand in the bay, what would be reasonable? Maybe it's River Mile 6, that's kind of a generally accepted place, right, Lee?
For salinity,
I certainly wouldn't recommend that you go study where the tidal line is. I think what I'm advocating for is that, like that project, it needs to feed into this, just like the recommendation for a transboundary water management institution. Because so much of what happens to what we're gonna do depends on what happens up there. So I certainly don't expect you to go into the Supreme Court and, that. But I do think those stakeholders up there can be our advocates in some ways. Certainly they're better off advocates than they are enemies, so.
Sure, absolutely. All right, Steve, you have another thing, or that just? Sorry. Okay, so I think we've discussed these, reasonably well for now. These are, evolutionary or organic, we'll revise them. Are there other strategies for ecosystem services or for the health of the bay system? I know we talked about a lot of things this morning, which are strategies for that as well. Is there anything else that you want to put on the table for this part of this before we move to B? Anybody have any additional strategies that you think should be evaluated against these performance measures for a healthy and productive bay ecosystem?
So I have a question about, so some of these actually have, a note that says need to discuss, define, clarify. Is that within
Yeah.
the ABSI team or within the community
Yeah.
advisory? So have we addressed those,
Yes.
all of them?
Yeah, I forgot I put those there. Yeah, well, these are things that when the team was discussing it, they need to be discussed and further clarify what amount of exposed shell each roof is that a useful metric? What does it mean? Somebody want? with that?
A lot of those questions are ones that I had, because I wasn't sure, what does the amount of exposed shell mean? Is that dead shell, live shell? What is it you're trying to get at? Is it area of habitat? Is it, I just wasn't sure, it seems to be rather not clearly defined.
So what I can do is I can send a note up to Mike Wilbur and ask him to respond to what is meant by these, and then give it to you, and you can look at it and see if it seems reasonable or not, you can bring it back, how's that?
Or ask the group.
Yeah, I can ask her too, sure, I mean, if that's on the table, maybe, yeah, we'll all be able to thoughts on what that means, if it's meaningful. So the amount of exposed shell on the tree, oyster shell density, are two that have that question that Sandra had articulated, about what do we mean, this actually means. Are they useful and what are we measuring?
I've had discussions in the past with oyster biologists. When you talk about exposed shell, Carrie came back in, maybe she can help answer this. Because what I'm about to say, I'm not sure is true or not, but I've been told that what people call new boxes, that is freshly dead shell, where the inside of the oyster, the shell is exposed and it hasn't had things attached to it, it hasn't aged and all that, makes a better place for spat to settle than the old shell that's already encrusted and that type of thing. So, is what I'm saying making any sense, Steve? So it's not so much percent exposure to shell, but I've been told that what they call a new box, the new boxes, which is fresh dead shell, those two halves that are open and available for settlement are much better places for spat to settle, which also could relate back to if we don't have many live oysters out there, so there's not any new boxes, maybe we're not getting the settlement of the spat because of that too. So, is that kind of true, Karen?
That's what I've heard. I have, FWC's taken over that part now, so I haven't physically seen the new numbers on any of that in recent years, but I've heard that as well from Billy Brown.
Yeah, I've heard it, I've never read it anywhere.
Yeah.
Okay.
Makes sense.
Yes.
Yeah, that does make sense.
Cool.
That would be a good,
I'm gonna talk about experience, because that's exactly right, because when you talking about dead shell that's been dead for a while, you very rarely find the spat on it. Most of your spat you find is on live oysters or freshly died oysters. It's my experience over 35 years in the bay.
so that might be a useful metric as we clarify to freshly dead shell, that spat.
And then, also that said, the last 4 years that I run the shelling program, I went out regular to check stuff. And the first year's spat set on it is always really better than the second, third year. I mean, it would actually be, the numbers would be 2 or 3 times more, the first spat set compared to the second, third year spat set, after it's been set in over a period of time.
So what about the oyster reef shell density in terms of the same thing about what do we mean by that?
That's a quick question.
Yeah.
The other stuff, and they said the answer. Doesn't live oyster shell put out something that the larvae, attracts larvae to it, so fresh shell or live oyster shell somehow attracts?
I don't know specifically about oysters, but that happens a lot with animals that they aggregate on their own species. There's chemicals that are released into the water and they're attracted to either biofilms associated with that or the animal, whatever the animal is. So yes.
Any thoughts on the oyster reef shell density as a metric?
I mean, again, if this is still within the confines of the ecosystem services, I think that the most important thing is gonna be the reef height measured in inches and meters, the reef area measured in acres, some other dimension. And then your shell density and your live density, these measured in numbers per square meter. I think those metrics that I just said.
So could you send those 4 metrics to us and we'll incorporate those in here?
Sure, and they are already here, it's just that there's a lot of additional stuff on here too. And so like, for example, clean boxes are really, really important, that's especially important for oyster recruitment. So, it's something that is important, but it's important for the point of what is your resultant lot density, what is your shell density.
So if you could just make that, identify those and send them to us, we'll clean it up. Thanks. All right, anything else on the ecosystem piece? Let's shift over to B on page 10, sustainable management of oyster resources. I think we talked about a lot of these this morning in terms of rotational harvest and all the things that we laid out. So I would ask, are there any other so-called management strategies, if you will, rotational harvest, all the things, better enforcement, all those things that we laid out this morning in the context of what might constitute a reopening based on some sustainability thing. Are there other strategies besides the whole list we made this morning that we should consider for the category B, the sustainable management of the oyster resource? What other strategies do we need to think about?
Surcharge on harvest oysters.
Okay, surcharge. What else? Yes, Sandra.
It's more of a question, Steve, you know, but I've heard that even though it's illegal to harvest anything under 3 inches, they can legally be sold, which sounds counterintuitive. Is that correct?
Right. So it's not, there is an allowance that allows harvesters to exceed, to go below that 3 inches if they're attached or unattached. There's a certain percentage depending on whether it's attached shell or it's unattached.
Oh, I see. Okay, so that isn't like a loophole that needs to be closed, it's just a tolerance within the harvest.
It's more of a bycatch, I think.
What about shell reclamation, reclaiming the shells?
It should be, well, there's a shell budget.
Yeah, I talked to a cousin of mine in North Carolina, and he said they're doing that in North Carolina. Getting shells, it's like, it's probably on a cook bottle or something.
Right, yeah, there's no.
I'm surprised they're doing that, it's a little bit of thing.
Yeah, it's an important piece, and we saw it on our presentation earlier today. I guess from DEG, that at one time there was a major requirement for company shells.
So much virus things we go for it. Ship them out, box, and then come back.
Yeah, so we have the shell budget there too as well, so that's probably, that fits over there. What else? Okay.
I don't think it's an issue. I don't understand the harvest, annual biomass by size category. I don't think that we are currently measuring the size category of harvest. Oftentimes, it's a harvestable organism that's harvested. So that might be a difficult metric, but
This is the harvest being total biomass by size category.
You mean in terms of, can we model it really well?
currently there's no data for that. And I don't know.
We can predict what would be left in the population, but it's not going to be really precise predictions, or is it something that we want to evaluate the success of the It's more important to try to understand, I would say the biomass of the oysters, but that was really an important point that was raised earlier, is we have to make sure that when we say biomass of oysters, it's comparable with historical, because this is a real challenge to go back through the data and sort out, like, was this pounds meat, was this pounds whole oyster, whole conversion rate, so we do have to sort that part out, but it's more important how much oyster we think we've brought in and how much oyster is left, that's what that's the currency that the models were about. And I would just like to a previous comment that I will write down to have the shell recycling as a specific management target. I know we have a shell budget in there, but that just means that we're accounting for the shell. The recycling is a different knob that we can put in the model, because when we build the model, we assume the oysters want a fresh dead shell. That requires that the oysters die generally a natural mortality on the reef, right? And they have that fresh dead shell out there. And so what the models right now that I have assume is when someone harvests an oyster, that shell's gone. And so we can have a proportion of that shell go back. We can decide whether it's gonna be just as good as the natural mortality shell, or if it's gonna be a little bit less good. We can decide as a group how to handle that, but it can be a specific knowledge we put on there. I'll write it down here and I'll send it to you.
Right, appreciate it. Good. Jenna and then Portia.
Oh, just a small thing I didn't see on here is, when the harvesters are processing the clumps on the boat, and they tend to move off the bar and move under like bridges and stuff for shade, do we wanna include some obligation, I don't know if that's something like an increased enforcement, that they have to return whatever small oysters they break apart off the clumps back to the reef where they got it, not half a mile away. I don't know, Shannon, no, yes, does that make any sense?
Makes great sense because, in the summertime, oystermen will tongue all morning long and run half a mile to the bridge to cut off. And for some reason, there'll be a pile of shells underneath that bridge, but they just don't reproduce oysters under there for some reason. They're growing the pilings, but they're not growing on the shell. I don't know if it's the shade, I don't know what the call is, but they do, they take away from the bars, you know, and that decreases the bars as well.
So
And that is a big major problem.
So Bob, put that under a strategy, that's a strategy, which is returning your shorts to the reef.
Is that not law now?
No, it's not.
It's not to my knowledge, but I think that, I don't think it's an enforcement thing anymore. It can be something on paper, I mean, why pass a law that's can't be enforced to some extent.
Could be a recommendation.
It could be a recommendation, yeah.
All right. Yes, Sonia.
Isn't that a stipulation for the Chesapeake, that they can't just cull as they go along, they have to stay on the reef to cull? It really was.
You know, I don't know for sure, but I think the answer is yes, but I have to, ask Mike or Leslie. But I think so, I mean, they're pretty, that shell reclamation is a huge issue. Maybe even worse than here. Jen, did I get you? Portia?
That was my comment too, was culling over the harvest area, because we require that over the aquaculture leases. They can't go anywhere else and cull, they have to stay over the area that they're working. And then the other thing, since we were talking about size tolerance, should there also be some type of guidance about other material in the bag? Because I know a few years ago, we were hearing about a lot of processors getting culture material in the bags in addition to oysters, just to kind of add to the weight of the bag. Because they have to process them so quickly, they don't always get to look at the bag. So rather than let the market kind of handle that on its own, should that be some guidance?
Sure, put it on the list and we'll discuss it. Those are all the strategies. Any other strategies or, anything else?
Checkpoints.
Checkpoints, so enforcement. So any other strategies or any other comments on the draft performance measures?
I was working some folks up in South Carolina, so one of the things that I was told there was that they have a series of reefs that are basically wild reefs, but they have leases on them, and oysters can go and they get a little section of their own reef, and it's their responsibility to maintain it and have to shell it, and it's their basically exclusive right to harvest that. Is that anything that has been considered here and it has been considered and you don't like it, it's fine. It requires we build the models in a really different way. So if that's something you want to investigate, I'm more than happy to do it, and I think it's really interesting, but,
What do you all think, Cory?
Well, so in the presentation that I did, that's exactly what those in perpetuity leases are, is they were areas that were historically oyster bars, and they were split up and assigned to certain individuals. Now, a lot of those have been gone over the years. I think Carrie has a map in her office that's amazing. It shows basically the entire bay was leased at one point. Now there's only about 50 of those left statewide, and there are some really large ones in Apalachicola Bay, but the department, at least from our perspective, we don't have the authority to issue those anymore. They have to be gone, now that's through the leasing program, and it's specific that there's no resource there. So we wouldn't have the authority to do something like that, but I don't know if FWC would. I think that I've heard a lot of comments on the Georgia and South Carolina program, because that's exactly what they do. And I think they have oysterman support because those bars then become private resource. But I think in Florida, that would be a really different perspective, because those areas have been public for so long, you might get a lot of pushback privatizing those areas.
So I think the statute changed quite a long time ago to prohibit that. But
Yeah, it was like 95.
Lee, you might have to answer that too, right?
Sorry, what's
Well, the question was about whether you could have private, submerged leases, at some stage of the,
on the public bars?
yeah.
I don't think that would work. Quite frankly.
Probably not.
Yeah.
I think it's
Not gonna
such
kill
a.
Yeah.
Might reduce the number of oystermen.
You want to follow that?
I believe that Louisiana will have this, where they have a portion of the bars that are public for everyone to use, and then they'll have a portion of the bars that is specifically for this type of lease. So the purpose isn't to take away all of those bars. There are some open access, but there are some other areas that are not. So if you say that Texas doesn't have the authority to do it, it's kind of a non-starter, and I would consider. Unless, like, FWC could do that, or.
It would actually take the cabinet to look and
Yeah.
probably have special legislation.
And the perception from the community is that would be, even if it was possibly non-popular.
Because those leases go back, like George said, some 100 years.
Well, I mean, yeah, they've been doing that, you got the 11-mile lease, I'm familiar with those people. There's no oysters there now, the problem he was having, 10 years ago was people stealing oysters off of his lease, So what do I do? So, no, I don't know the next.
Okay, let's work this form, but it sounds like it's not practical for this area. Lee?
Yeah, the third one from the bottom, an updated oyster fishery and aquaculture enforcement plan that is approved by fishery farmers and distributors, as well as FWC law enforcement. One of the problems we've had around here for many years is the oyster cases that are made by the law enforcement, the FWC law enforcement. They go before the local county judge. And a lot of times you'll see the law enforcement people who are making the cases, they don't make any more cases because all the cases get thrown out a lot. And so I guess what I'm saying is we need to either add the local judge who's presiding over those cases, or we need to put something in there that, and there's been suggestions made in the past that did not go before a local county judge who owes his office to a lot of oystermen sometimes. But somehow it needs to be in there that whoever's gonna enforce the law in the court needs to be a part of this Sign it off on a plane.
So it's all the local county commission and the judge system.
Huh?
And probably also the local government, county commission, for instance. All that is part of it. Yeah.
No, I keep the county commission out. There's a lot of people that are related to a lot of people.
Yeah. All right. Anything else? Okay, so I'm just gonna do, so it's now 1:40. Do you want to continue going into C and D, or are y'all, like, had enough for today? I'm gonna leave this up to the groups, I'm sensing a rain down. You've done a lot of good work today, and if you want to continue, I'm happy to stay till 3, but I don't want it to be a slog for y'all. What's your take? Give me some feedback, Steve. Come on, speak up.
I've got to go deal with the flood issue myself,
All right,
but
well,
out of the river.
before you leave, let me just pass these out. Yeah, we're gonna talk about dates, but I just wanna see if they wanna keep responding. There's a few more things we need to do anyway. Are y'all feeling like you're kind of done for the day?
Yeah.
Come on, give me some feedback.
Yes.
Let's go. All right. Let's talk about the next meeting and dates. So we had changed the next meeting date to the May 13th. I'm going from memory, this is older.
Yes.
And primarily to accommodate a member who is not here today. But what we found out is that the next commission meeting, the Fish and Wildlife Commission meeting is on that date, and
13 and 14. 13 and
it's on the 13th and 14th. And that would be Jim and Mike, which, you know, which we'd like to have here. So the thought is maybe we should bring it back to May the 6th. What?
We'll be able to.
Tom can't make it for that date, that's true.
And that would out smoking in.
What's that?
That would also eliminate smoking again, right?
But is he gonna come?
I'm just throwing it out there,
No,
throwing it out there.
yeah, that's why we changed it. But as you see, he's not here. Huh? On the 6th. Okay. So what about we do it in that, where, do you know where the next commission meeting is? It's on the 13th and 14th?
Miami,
So it probably wouldn't work for y'all to be here on the 15th, or would it?
Jim, I mean, no, not with Jim. I think for me, it's also doesn't conflict with the other group.
What do y'all think? We haven't done it either way.
Yeah, it might be better to have it after this next, the board, the FWC commission meeting.
And there might be easier conversation to be had,
Yes.
potentially.
Okay, well, the trick will be, you know, so we're talking about doing it after that week, right?
Yeah.
So what would be the date?
Well, like, there's, what the other said, it would be the beginning of November.
That might be a little bit difficult. It would- But still, that's a lot to go back and drive home.
Trying to see if there's anything that's happening.
Folks, would May 27th work for your calendars? So we're proposing potentially May 27th. Would that work? Anybody have any issues with that? That work for you? Yeah.
Say, yeah, I'll make it work.
May 27th?
It's a Wednesday.
Yeah, I don't think. I just think that make it.
Good.
I can't do it.
I will tell you that when I get back.
Oh, yeah.
All right, we'll choose. So that date doesn't work for June.
So, and I can proxy it, if you guys so.
Yeah.
Because that, commission.
So what about the,
I guess we could,
Yeah.
26th or the 28th then?
28th is out for me.
26th? No, that's still part of the same.
Jeff has some of the towns that are on together.
Those two, 26, 28.
I don't know what they're for.
I'm gonna go check.
well, that'd be a big lift.
Yeah, it would be. Is that gonna be the only day, the 20th we include?
Well, the 20th, I think, is that, the 20th we had problems with
That's the Pensacola meeting,
Yeah,
the
and
Pensacola maybe?
but that's, it's been moved to the 19th.
okay.
Yeah, so it's,
So-
we'd have to drive all this in
So
there.
a couple of us would be
Directly.
on the road.
21st.
And the 21st or 22nd?
So 26 or 27.
Well, we'll start on the 20th, I guess. Is the 20th a better day?
21st or 22nd? Is that what you think it might be?
Well, I could do the 22nd, not 21st. How about the 22nd?
Yeah.
Okay, let's land on May 22nd. It's Friday, May 22nd. We'll go from 8:30 to 2.
Let me go
Is
check,
that
make
not
sure
good?
this room is available.
May 22nd. Let's make sure we have the room first. That's our final.
The week of the 25th is wide open. She's checking.
All right, so we're just gonna wait for that. In the meantime, is there anybody who wants to make any public comment?
Use the microphone.
So next meeting, as soon as we get the okay on the facility, we'll continue from where we are. We'll get a report back from FWC. So folks, are there any particular presentations you want for the next meeting? We have quite a few nice things to say. Is there additional information?
Hang on, I have to, sorry.
It's about 22nd.
Available.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and book that.
It's a Friday.
Yeah, it's Friday.
Yeah.
Life is short and beauty short. Yes, Chuck.
Earlier, Anna was talking about that visit that does the testing. Like they keep going back to the same place all the time because that's a GPS reason. I don't understand why they go to the same place every time, other than to get great data. So they should go like a California, they should go to 4 or 5 places on the bar. I don't understand the rationale of some of that as a lady.
Go ahead.
So for the nervous sampling, John stated that he presented this morning. It's supposed to be done every 6 months, but because of Hurricane Michael and other things going on, it's been much longer. So first of all, he's not going back to each of those sites, within a short period. It's several months. It's over a year, I think, between the last 2 samplings. And then he's got multiple points that he uses on the larger reefs. And so he does have a midpoint that he goes to. And of course, a GPS is only good within, 30 feet. And so you kind of you're putting anchor down on that point, but you're not going back to the same exact point. And then from there, once he has the boat anchored, he's putting out 15 quadrats away from the boat. So they'll go out 5 from the starboard and 5 from the, and then 5 off the bow. So especially since it sounds like the same spot.
That's gonna be key to reopening the bay, those studies.
Sure.
So if you're doing a natural survey of a natural reef, you don't do it that way necessarily. I mean, there's different ways to do it, but you've got a big area that's just natural reef, for example, and you want to survey and understand what's going on, you might randomize it, or you might nest it and randomize it. But I think the limitation that these restoration projects have is that they've restored a particular area, so they have to go back to that area, and as Jenna said, it's not exactly the same point, but they are sort of limited, because they want to know what that particular area looks like. I don't know if you have any thoughts.
I think we're with the staff.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure about that, I mean, FWC is also sampling the natural reefs, and so I think they do this, that's a Melanie question, and Matt.
I was thinking about seeing if we can have that on the top.
Yeah, I bet that
We're gonna give it a talk.
That's one of the things.
That's really interesting.
So I'm not 100% sure if they're randomizing it or if they're going back to the same location each time.
It's generally the same area, but they do something similar to what because they have restoration projects as well. So I think it depends what they're surveying.
So what about other presentations? What other, are there other things that information needs we'd like to have presentations on?
I am,
Said Melody Parker?
yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Put her on there.
Melody.
Melanie Melanie. That's FMWI.
That's a-
And also that came up with,
yes.
Okay, go ahead, Chad.
it also came up
I'm
with.
just curious to know, does anybody else in this room think what happens at the Supreme Court or what the Corps of Engineers does have anything to do with what we're doing? Because there's a couple of scenarios for the Supreme Court, I guess. You know, but it would be helpful maybe, at least to me, I've heard a lot of different things. If somebody could tell us, or can tell us, I mean, we know what's scheduled right now and when. But some of the people I've trusted that seem to know a lot think that's gonna string out into the summer of 2021 before we'll know whether Florida's just at the mercy of Georgia or some miracle happened before then. And then, of course, the Corps of Engineers has their water control manual, which is kind of a done deal unless the Riverkeeper lawsuit wins and Florida joins in. But I mean, is that information that would be useful to what we're doing here? The scenarios of potential flows because of Corps' action or because of the Supreme Court action?
Well, one of the things, I know that Steve Lightman has been working with the scientists at the Army Corps to make sure that, you know, using the same data set, that they can get the same results using the Stella model and whatever model that the Corps is using. And he's made a lot of headway with that, so I don't know if you're talking about maybe inviting the Army Corps scientists, or are you you're thinking more politically?
Steve could do a presentation on both of them. He's, you know, he teaches a course in it.
Right.
I think it would be useful information from his point of view. I don't know, you need to reach out to the chief of staff at the Corps, to, you know, to the general counsel's office. I don't know that he'd show up. But I think Steve could answer both of
Okay,
those questions in probably a 10-minute summation.
okay, tell me quickly the 2 points, it's about the
The
water.
water control manual, they've approved it and they're operating under that new manual unless there's a court case that's suing them for part of that.
Okay,
But then, you know, what's the status of Supreme Court case? I
okay.
think you can do both of those well
Okay,
without hitting the hornet's nest of the court and
okay.
general counsel.
Go ahead.
So, yeah, we were talking to Steve earlier on, I guess, really good idea, if Steve could do that. Another thing that he would like to do, whether this is next time or down the road, is to set aside some time for the group to sort of play around with his model and put different management and climate scenarios into it so that we can see actually what happened to the flows under those different scenarios. And I think this would be valuable, but it may not be the next, you know, meeting that we do it at, but something to bear in mind. Steve really wants to do that, he's keen to do it.
And I think after the next meeting, I'm sorry.
Sorry, Mike, you had your hand
No,
up.
no, no, I'm good.
You're good?
Well, I've got another comment to make to clarify something you said earlier, but let's continue this conversation.
All right,
30 seconds ago.
We had a guy named Robert Williams, who's the general counsel for DEP, come, talk to our group a while back about, the litigation and all you were asking about. I don't know if you could invite him, he came down here and gave us a presentation and updated what was going on. And water, Robert Williams.
Okay, if you would just coordinate that with Alicia and Sandra, that'd be great.
And I remember my other thing, I was, just gonna say that if we're gonna spend a lot of time at the May meeting talking about things that happened, trying to get where we didn't finish today, and also, continue our discussion on closure and anything that FWC can tell us at that point, we might not have time for too many talks, so I could push Steve, so I'll, his second Steve.
We'll just make a list of them,
Thing
and
to,
we'll make
the
a
next
decision
meeting.
based on. We're gonna need, I wanna say at least a couple of hours, for June, and Mike to report back with us and discuss that, what the commissioner said.
Say a couple hours.
Well, there's probably gonna be a lively discussion about what's next.
150 slides.
No, we don't want a couple-hour presentation, we want a discussion after your brief presentation. Lee, you're next.
I mean, it'll be a thumbs up or thumbs down.
I'd still like to see some sort of presentation related to the other Gulf states, the status of their oyster fishery, maybe how they regulate it. I know if you go into a big giant manual that the ISO puts out, all that stuff's in there, but it's hard to distill it. Do they do things a little different than we do?
Yes.
Florida, how are they doing it, what's the status of their fishery? I mean, I know like, as you move west of here, a lot of oyster fisheries are more like a put and take fishery than they are, where everybody's putting out spat on shells and that kind of stuff. So, just to give us an idea of how the other Gulf states are doing their thing.
So in Maryland, what we have a 1 day off in the regular, I need y'all to listen to this. So I want everybody to hear this. So what we did there is we had a 1 day, wasn't a 4 day oyster symposium where people came from all these different locations, British Columbia, all these different states, and give presentations on just what you described. I mean, maybe we can do it in a shorter thing, this is something to think about, the question is who would be the presenter here, is it to glean information, or is it something that one person can compile? Anyway, just thoughts, go ahead.
That might be something we can organise around our science advisory board, because we've got, quite people that know what they're talking about right there, who are brought into places, so that's something we can work on if it's interesting.
Yeah, that might be a great opportunity.
So that meeting that I said I was at yesterday is actually the first meeting of the Gulf States Marine Fisheries Commission Molluscan Shellfish Subcommittee. It's a committee convened of all 5 Gulf states, and we actually had similar conversation, an update on aquaculture and wild fishery for oysters. So that might be interesting to see how that would play out, but that might be worth coordinating with the facilitator.
Okay.
Not the
Do they
vice chair.
have like?
Not the vice chair.
Do they have like an executive director that could come talk about all that stuff?
They do have, I can't commit them to it, but
Yeah.
that could
Maybe
be
you can
something.
check it out, whether there's somebody who could compile for the 5 Gulf states, their sort of status of the fishery and their management, regime, regulation, something like that. Simple thing.
It'd be a very difficult compilation of information, but okay.
They must have slideshows they give all the time.
So the guy named Seth Butch used to live here with the Nature Conservancy now at Louisiana.
Yeah.
And he's really involved with a lot of oyster restoration out there and in Texas, I believe. So he's very knowledgeable on efforts out there, and techniques and issues. think you would be a good person to come talk to us a little bit about their efforts, their experiences, and their successes and failures.
Yeah, and a few years ago, I remember Shannon was at the one meeting, but the Gulf of Mexico initiative, they're called GoMexi. Beth Walton heads that group, and she traveled around to all the different Gulf states and talked, I can't remember how many years ago that was, at least 3. And Seth was at those meetings, but just kind of surveyed the wild and aquaculturists about what their vision was and what they wanted to see. And she did, I think, 3 meetings in Florida and then a few in Louisiana and Texas. So she might be an interesting person to come and kind of talk about what she gathered from that and what they're working on as well.
And she bring others to Bill,
Yeah.
presentation. Bill Walton. He's
2 for
coming.
1.
All right, well, we'll put all this in the mix, we'll sort through what's possible for the next meeting in the context of the agenda, we'll get to it all.
Bill Walton, he's
UCLA?
with the University of Auburn, he's like one of the foremost leading oyster experts in the Gulf of Mexico. And he can come here and, just, Beth?
Beth's his wife,
Yeah, right, that's her husband.
Okay.
He came to, it was a Triumph thing over in, Panama City that time. Right. So we get that big
I
presentation.
think we'll work on it.
Panama City.
We have no.
He was over there with the aquaculture thing that time.
He just came into our reapplication meeting last week
Oh,
to
he did?
present it on gear, so yeah, he's very open to helping any way he can.
Any other final comments or thoughts?
So I wanted to clarify my comment on the calling stuff. I did look at our rule. Within the definition of call, it does talk about it relative to the area that it was harvested. So I wanted to make sure, especially since this is a recorded session, that I clarify that there is some language in our rule about that.
So there is a.
I don't know, I'd have to refer to, or check with law enforcement to see if that's a citable offense or anything like that, if it's, I'd have to have that checked with law.
So maybe if you don't mind, just report back.
Yeah.
to me.
You don't know if it's enforceable.
Well, I mean, in order to define culling, it defines the practice of doing it in the area where the oysters sort of do, versus harvest, which is not included in culling. So I'd have to see if that's actually, how that falls into the legal interpretation.
All right. So if y'all feel like your evaluations and leaving, we appreciate it, and we'll see you at 8:30 on May 22nd here in facility. Appreciate the good work, everybody. Nice. Thank you.